In the heart of the magnificent New York, where skyscrapers proudly rise into the blue sky, there is a luxury hotel called Evergrande, a place only for high-class guests. But in that splendor and luxury, a small and seemingly harmless event happened. An old woman walked into the hotel lobby with trembling hands and a gentle smile, just hoping to find a place to rest. However, she was flatly rejected without anyone knowing that the event would become the focus of the whole United States, bringing with it secrets and valuable lessons. What really happened behind that magnificent door? And who is that woman? The answer will surprise you more than you think. If you love deep and meaningful stories, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos. We are always here, with you, telling stories that touch your heart. The Evergrande Hotel is located in the heart of bustling New York City, where every detail exudes luxury. The grand lobby is decorated with sparkling crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and walls covered with exquisite patterned wallpaper. Outside, the late autumn wind blows the red and yellow maple leaves gently on the street. People are bustling back and forth, but inside the hotel is a quiet, classy space reserved for distinguished guests. The glass door opened automatically, revealing the figure of Mrs. Martha Johnson, a black woman over 65 years old. She wore an old grey coat and a worn woolen scarf. Her gait was slow. Each step was a bit heavy but full of serenity. Her eyes shone with gentleness but also sparkled with the experience of someone who had gone through many storms in life. She walked up to the reception desk with a smile. Across the counter, Kevin Turner, a young man in an impeccable receptionist uniform, was busy with his phone. His eyes glanced quickly at Martha, not hiding his annoyance.
"Hello? I'm here to check in. I made a reservation over the phone,"
Martha said, her voice warm but a little tired. Kevin raised his head and glanced at her from head to toe. His gaze was cold and distant, as if her presence polluted this luxurious space. "What's your name?" Kevin asked, his tone not hiding his reluctance. "Martha Johnson." Kevin tapped a few keys on the computer, pretending to check the information. After a few seconds, he curled his lips and shook his head. "Unfortunately, our hotel is fully booked," he announced, his tone clearly lacking in goodwill. Mrs. Martha frowned slightly but kept her smile. "But I made a reservation last week. I have the confirmation email." She pulled out a neatly printed piece of paper. Kevin glanced at the paper but remained indifferent. "We did make a reservation, but the hotel is fully booked today. We're sorry." Mrs. Martha was thoughtful for a moment. There was no anger or resentment in her eyes. She just nodded silently, slowly folded the paper, and put it in her bag.
"Thank you," she said softly. "Have a nice day."
Then she turned and walked away, slowly but firmly. Kevin watched, thinking that this was it. Little did he know that those slow steps would lead to a storm he never expected. Outside the hotel, the wind was cold and bitter, but Martha kept a smile on her face, as if this injustice was just a passing breeze in her life. She walked, blending into the bustling crowd on the street, unaware that her story was about to become the center of attention. Darkness gradually fell. The streetlights began to light up, but her mind seemed to drift back to the old days, where memories appeared and disappeared like old films, faint but unforgettable. Martha was just 25 years old. Life in Selma, Alabama, was not easy for black people like her family. Her husband, James Johnson, was a factory worker with calloused hands but a passionate heart. He regularly participated in marches for voting rights and equality for black people, despite the lurking dangers. One morning in March, while she was pregnant with their first son, James returned home with a bruised face and torn clothes. He had been attacked by racists for speaking out at a protest in the town centre. "Martha, they will never leave us alone," James said, his voice shaking with pain but not fear. "But I can't stop fighting. If we stay silent, they will forever despise us." Martha silently bandaged her husband's wound, tears falling but not a word of complaint. She understood that this fight was not only for James, but also for his entire family and the entire black community that was thirsting for justice. A few months later, amid street chants, Martha gave birth to her son, David Johnson. The hospital refused to admit them because they were black, forcing her to give birth at home with the help of an old midwife in the neighborhood. She clearly remembered the pain of holding David's tiny hand, feeling the newborn's weak breath. In that moment, she vowed to do everything she could to protect her child, no matter how harsh life was. "David, you must grow up strong," she whispered. "You must be different. You must use your intelligence and kindness to change the world." Life became increasingly difficult when James lost his job because of his activism. The family fell into poverty. Martha took on many menial jobs, laundry and cleaning houses for wealthy white families. There were days when her hands were red from washing clothes in cold water, but she never complained. "Mum, why do they hate us so much?" David, now 10, once asked his mother after watching his father arrested for protesting. "Because they don't understand that we are all the same," she replied, stroking his soft, curly hair. "You have to forgive them, but you can't let them beat you down. You have to stand up, but stand up with love, not with hate." David grew up surrounded by these teachings, and it was thanks to his mother's lessons that he became an intelligent, determined, and compassionate man. When David turned 18, a tragic event occurred. James died after a protest was suppressed by the police. That day, Martha and David stood by the simple grave, the wind blowing coldly. Martha held her son's hand tightly, her eyes filled with tears, but her voice still strong.
"Your father is gone, but his spirit will live on. You must continue on this path in his place."
David did not disappoint his mother. He was determined to go to law school and become a civil rights lawyer. Martha was both a mother and a father, raising her children alone in poverty, but always maintained her self-respect and belief in justice. The honking of a car horn brought Martha back to reality. It was dark, and she was still walking slowly down the sidewalk. The memories were still vivid in her mind, reminding her that no discrimination, no matter how small or large, could be ignored. But she did not get angry. She was used to facing injustice with patience and kindness. She knew that what had happened at the hotel today would not end as simply as Kevin thought. This was just the beginning, and she believed that justice would be served. No resentment, just the truth. "Everything has its time," she muttered, and continued walking, blending into the bustling crowd. Martha finally found a small roadside cafe to rest. The cafe was cozy. The soft yellow light from the hanging lamps created a peaceful feeling. She sat down on a chair by the window, ordered a cup of hot tea, and took out her phone to call her son, David Johnson. David Johnson was sitting in his law office. His office was on the top floor of a luxury building, the city lights twinkling outside. His desk was neat, but piled with files, the mark of a man who was busy with major civil rights cases. "Hi, Mom." David's voice came through the phone, warm but tinged with concern. "Are you at the hotel? Is everything okay?" Mrs. Martha took a sip of tea, trying to keep her voice calm but unable to hide her sadness. "Everything is fine, honey, but I'm not staying at the Evergrande Hotel. They said there were no rooms available. David frowned. He stopped writing, leaned back in his chair, and stared out the window. No rooms available? His voice was sharper. Are you sure? You booked in advance, confirmed by email. Mrs. Martha smiled softly over the phone, trying to soothe her son.
It's okay, David. I think maybe they really are out of rooms.
But David knew his mother too well. Her voice was calm, but things were not that simple. His instincts as a lawyer and son kicked in, and he sensed something was wrong. "Mom, did they show any attitude?" David asked, his voice more serious. Mrs. Martha was silent for a moment, then gently replied, "It's nothing to worry about, son. Don't worry." But the silence was the answer. David couldn't sit still any longer. He hung up and immediately checked his email for the reservation confirmation. The data was clear. Mrs. Martha had booked the room a week ago. The facts were undeniable. This was no ordinary incident, but a blatant act of discrimination. It didn't take David long to find the phone number of Sarah Collins, the manager of the Evergrande Hotel. He picked up the phone and called immediately, his voice calm but cold.
Hello? This is David Johnson. I need to speak to Sarah Collins, the hotel manager.
On the other end of the line, Sarah Collins had just finished a long meeting and was about to leave the office when she received the call. David's voice made her stop immediately. Sarah was a middle-aged professional woman with a long history of management in the hotel industry.
I'm Sarah Collins. Mr. Johnson, how can I help you?
David paused for a second, trying to keep calm.
My mother, Mrs. Martha Johnson, was just refused a room at your hotel by her front desk. I would like to know why.
Sarah was momentarily confused. She turned on her computer and quickly searched for information. Sure enough, Martha Johnson's name appeared on the reservation list. "Mr. Johnson, let me double-check. It could be a mistake," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice professional.
"Mistaken?"
David interrupted, his voice icy.
"Tell me why your front desk claimed the hotel was fully booked when my mother had clearly made a reservation."
Sarah was silent. She checked the room status file and saw clearly that there were still rooms available. David's words rang in her ears. "I'm sorry," Sarah replied. "I'll check it out right away and get back to you as soon as possible." David emphasized each word. "I want answers now. This is not the first time I have seen something like this happen. If your hotel refuses my mother for any reason related to skin color or any discrimination, I will not hesitate to take this matter to the press and legal action." Sarah realized the seriousness of the situation. Her voice was soft but tense. "Mr. Johnson, I understand. I need time to review the whole situation. I promise to have an answer as soon as possible." David did not give in.
"You have 24 hours.
He hung up, leaving Sarah in shock. She knew this was no small matter and could seriously damage the hotel's reputation. After a tense call with David Johnson, Sarah Collins sat in her office, eyes full of worry. She tried to stay calm, but she knew this could become a major scandal if not handled carefully. Sarah had always prided herself on her professionalism, and the thought that her hotel might be involved in discrimination made her uneasy. Sarah opened the reservation system on her computer again. She searched for Martha Johnson, and sure enough, her name was still on the reservation list.
"How could there be no room?"
Sarah muttered, searching for any fault that could explain this refusal. She pressed the button to check room status. There were still more than 10 rooms available, including the one Martha had booked. Sarah frowned and quickly called the front desk. Kevin Turner, the young receptionist, picked up the phone with a somewhat tired tone. "Front desk, this is Kevin Turner. Sarah immediately asked. "Kevin, Mrs. Martha Johnson is checking in this afternoon. Why did you turn her away?" Kevin hesitated for a moment, but then replied calmly, "Ma'am, I was just following policy. I told her the hotel was fully booked." "But we still have rooms available," Sarah insisted. "Have you checked?" I think it was a system error, but she didn't complain, so I think everything is fine." Sarah sensed the evasiveness in Kevin's voice. The simmering anger began to rise. "Kevin, I request you to double-check immediately. This is a serious matter. If I find any shortcomings, you will be held responsible." "I understand, Ma'am," Kevin replied, but his voice remained indifferent. Sarah knew that she couldn't rely on Kevin's explanation. She quickly called security and asked for the video footage from the front desk surveillance camera around the time Martha checked in. Sitting in front of the monitor, Sarah watched each frame carefully. The video showed the reception desk at 3 p.m. Mrs. Martha walked in, looking tired but still smiling gently. She went to the front desk and handed over the reservation confirmation. Kevin Turner glanced at her indifferently, then tapped a few keys on his computer. His face showed no ill will. After a few seconds, Kevin shook his head and said something to Mrs. Martha. His expression was clearly cold, even a little disdainful. Mrs. Martha nodded silently, folded up the reservation, and left without a word of complaint. Sarah sat motionless, her eyes glued to the screen. She replayed the video again, this time paying closer attention to Kevin's expression. It was all too clear. There had been no mistake.
"Unacceptable!"
Sarah whispered, feeling a mixture of anger and shame. Sarah knew that this matter could not be resolved peacefully. She immediately summoned Kevin to her office. When Kevin entered, his face was calm but a little confused by Sarah's serious expression. "Kevin," Sarah began, her voice cold, "I just reviewed the surveillance cameras. Would you like to explain why you refused Martha Johnson?" Kevin was confused.
"Ma'am, like I said, I think the system is full."
Sarah interrupted, her voice becoming firm. "Don't lie to me. I saw your attitude clearly through the camera. The system was not at fault. So how do you explain your actions?" Kevin was speechless, unable to answer. After a moment of silence, he mumbled, I don't think she's the right kind of guest for our hotel." Sarah glared at Kevin, her voice filled with indignation. "Not the right kind of guest? What do you mean? Because she's black? Do you understand what you've done? You've put this hotel in a crisis because of your racist behavior." Kevin bowed his head, unable to find any words to defend himself. "You immediately write a detailed report and submit it to me immediately. After that, you should prepare yourself for the consequences." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind reeling. She knew things had gone too far. A simple apology would not appease David Johnson or the public. A storm was brewing, and there was nothing she could do but brace herself for the consequences. The next morning, the sky over New York was still grey, but the atmosphere in the Evergrande Hotel was as tense as a string. After David Johnson's call, a series of events happened quickly, like a fire starting from a small spark, spreading rapidly and uncontrollably. At 8 a.m., Sarah's phone was buzzing with messages and calls from reporters and lawyers. A social media post by David Johnson quickly went viral. "My mother, Martha Johnson, was denied a room at the Evergrande Hotel because it was full, even though there were plenty of rooms available. This is not just a mistake. This is racial discrimination. I demand a fair and public explanation. Justice will be served." The post featured a photo of Martha standing at the front desk, looking tired but calm. Within hours, the post had garnered thousands of shares and angry comments.
This is horrible. How can this still happen in the 21st century? We need to boycott this hotel immediately. David Johnson is a civil rights lawyer. Evergrande will not get away with this. Hashtags like #justice for Martha, #racism, #Evergrande Hotel quickly trended on Twitter and other social platforms. In the manager's office, Sarah sat in front of her computer screen, her eyes glued to the articles and news that were coming in every minute. Major news outlets like the New York Times, CNN, and NBC were all reporting on the incident. The hotel's general manager, Thomas Bennett, immediately called an emergency meeting. His face was tense, his eyes filled with worry as he faced Sarah and the key staff. "Sarah, this is getting out of control. What do we do now?" Thomas asked, his voice urgent. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "We need to issue a public apology immediately. There is no denying this mistake. We must take responsibility and deal with the consequences." Thomas nodded, but his face was still full of worry. "It's not just an apology. We need to do more. The hotel is at risk of being sued and seriously damaged." That afternoon, the Evergrande Hotel held an emergency press conference. Sarah appeared before a group of reporters with a tired but serious expression. Standing in front of the podium, she took a deep breath, looked at the crowd, and began to speak. "On behalf of Evergrande Hotel, I sincerely apologize to Ms. Martha Johnson and her family for what happened. This was a serious mistake, and we take full responsibility. The hotel is committed to fully investigating the incident and will properly handle those involved. But this apology was not enough to calm the wave of anger. Reporters pressed their questions. Do you accept that this was an act of racism? How can the hotel restore its reputation after this incident? Has Martha received a personal apology? Sarah replied in a calm voice. We do not tolerate any form of discrimination and will do everything in our power to correct this mistake. Ms. Martha has received a personal apology from me, and we will compensate her for her losses. Despite the apology, public anger was not appeased. Human rights groups began to speak out, calling for a boycott of the hotel. Small protests broke out in front of the Evergrande, with banners reading, "Justice for all," "End racism," "No justice, no peace." Hotel staff, especially Kevin Turner, were also heavily attacked on social media. Under increasing pressure, Kevin was immediately fired and forced to publicly apologize. In a television interview, David appeared calm but determined. I don't want to tear anyone down, but justice needs to be served. This isn't the first time we've seen discrimination. What I want is real change, not just an apology. I want everyone, regardless of skin color or background, to be treated with respect. David's words resonated strongly, making the public even more supportive. Evergrande Hotel racism scandal is no longer a small internal story. In just a few days, the incident has become the focus of national media. From social media to television news, the name Evergrande is closely associated with the image of discrimination. David Johnson, a civil rights attorney, has filed a formal lawsuit against the Evergrande Hotel. In the lawsuit, he asks the hotel to financial compensation to Ms. Martha Johnson for mental suffering, commit to changing policies to prevent any future discrimination, train staff on anti-racism awareness under the supervision of human rights organizations. David did not ask for a specific amount of compensation, but the media reported that the amount could be in the millions of dollars. For a high-end hotel like Evergrande, this is not only a matter of money,
but also an irreparable loss of reputation. A week after the incident, Sarah Collins decided to take the initiative to meet David. She made an appointment with him at a small cafe, away from the noise of the hotel. David arrived, dressed neatly in a suit, his eyes sharp but unable to hide his fatigue. Sarah sighed softly and began, "Thank you for coming. I want to say that I am truly sorry for what happened. There are no words that can justify it." David looked at Sarah silently, then replied, "You know, I don't want to ruin anyone's career, but I can't let this go. This isn't just about my mother, it's about the millions of people who have been treated so unfairly." Sarah nodded, her voice low. "I understand. We made a terrible mistake. I just want to know, is there any way to make amends?" David was silent for a moment, then said, "Start with real change, not just talk." The very next day, the Evergrande Hotel held a major press conference. Sarah Collins stood before dozens of cameras, this time not as an authoritative manager, but as the person responsible for the mistakes that had occurred. She held the microphone, her voice trembling but sincere. "We acknowledge that we failed in our responsibilities. This was not just an individual failure, but a systemic failure. We sincerely apologize to Martha Johnson and her family. We are committed to change." Sarah announced a series of new measures. The receptionist who engaged in discriminatory behavior was fired. Invite human rights experts to train all staff on anti-discrimination awareness. Establish a consumer rights fund in Martha Johnson's name to support people who have experienced discrimination. The speech ended in silence. No one applauded, but the sincerity in Sarah's words moved many. After being fired, Kevin Turner faced a wave of public criticism. He lost his job, his reputation was ruined, and he became the focus of outrage on social media. Kevin tried to apologize in the media, but all his words were meaningless compared to what he had caused. "I was wrong. I cannot justify my actions. I apologize to Martha Johnson and her family. I will never forget this lesson." Kevin's apology appeared in a small interview, but few people paid attention. He paid a heavy price for his disrespect and discrimination. Meanwhile, Mrs. Martha Johnson remained as calm as ever. In a television interview, she was asked if she forgave Kevin Turner and the Evergrande Hotel. She smiled gently, her eyes sparkling with tolerance. "I am old. I have no time to be angry. I forgive them, but forgiveness does not mean forgetting. We need to remember to learn, to change, and so that the next generation does not have to suffer the same thing." A year later, the Evergrande Hotel has gradually restored its reputation through serious and sincere reforms. The Martha Johnson Foundation has become a symbol of positive change, supporting many people in the community. Sarah continues to be the manager, but she knows that the hotel's reputation has come at a great cost. David Johnson, despite his victory, continues his fight for justice. A peaceful autumn afternoon, yellow leaves covered the sidewalks in Central Park. There was no more noise from public opinion, no more camera lights or public scrutiny. Everything seemed to return to normal, but in the hearts of those involved, the memory of the event at the Evergrande Hotel still lingered like a scar that would not fade. In a small corner of the park, Mrs. Martha Johnson sat on a bench, wearing a light purple sweater. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her eyes were still warm and peaceful. An old book was open on her lap, but she didn't seem to be reading, just looking at the clear blue sky. Suddenly, a figure quietly approached her. It was Kevin Turner.
the receptionist who had coldly rejected her that day. He was wearing an old coat. His face was haggard and his eyes were filled with remorse. He stood before her, bewildered like a child who had made a mistake. Finally, he spoke, his voice trembling. "Mrs. Martha, may I sit down for a moment, if you don't mind?" Mrs. Martha looked up, momentarily surprised, but then smiled slightly. "Sit down, young man. I don't mind." Kevin sat down, silent for a long time. Finally, he hesitated. "I hurt you. I don't know what to say except I'm sorry. I was wrong. So wrong." Mrs. Martha looked at him, her eyes gentle, then said softly, "You know, Kevin, I don't blame you. Everyone has their moments of failure. The important thing is that you realize it and change." Kevin bowed his head, his voice choked. "I lost everything after that. My job, my reputation, and my self-respect. But what I regret most is not realizing the value of kindness sooner." Mrs. Martha gently placed her hand on Kevin's, the gentle touch a deep comfort. "Loss is sometimes the most valuable lesson, Kevin, but no one loses everything when they are still sorry and want to start over." A few weeks after that meeting, Kevin began volunteering at a community center funded by the Martha Johnson Foundation. He tutored disadvantaged children, helped them with their homework, and shared his story as a lesson for future generations. During a volunteer session, Kevin met David Johnson again. David saw the change in Kevin and nodded slightly. "You have found the right path. The important thing is not that you were wrong, but that you are trying to correct it." The two shook hands, no longer hostile, only sympathy and respect remained. One morning, Martha received a letter from Kevin. In the letter he wrote, "Dear Martha, I don't know how to thank you enough for the kindness and love you have shown me. You have taught me the most valuable lesson in life. Forgiveness not only saves others, but also saves yourself. I will never forget you, and I will live to be worthy of your kindness. Sincerely, Kevin Turner." Martha read the letter and smiled. She knew she had done the right thing. She had not only forgiven, but also helped a man find himself again. Winter has come, but the atmosphere in people's hearts is warmer than ever. The Evergrande Hotel, after drastic reforms, has become a symbol of change. The Martha Johnson Foundation is growing, helping many people and spreading the message of kindness. Mrs. Martha, sitting by the fire with her son David, sipped hot tea and said softly, "You know, David, sometimes we don't need to win with anger. Love and forgiveness are the greatest powers." David smiled, his eyes full of respect. "Mom always taught me that, and you are the best example of tolerance." The story ends not with anger or resentment, but with love and forgiveness, the most valuable lesson anyone can carry with them in life.